Thanks for those who've organised this event. Thank you, Mia. Just a little bit about myself. Like Steph, I was nurtured into evangelical faith from infancy, and therefore, not surprisingly, ended up at Moore Theological College, where closer, yeah, where Steph is currently studying, and firstly as an undergraduate. And then after a stint in pastoral ministry in the bush, went back there to teach 10 years full-time and 5 years part-time. So I'm probably, I think you'd have to say, a surprising candidate to be sitting here tonight in support of marriage equality. But I am, in fact, an ardent supporter, and just to kick things off tonight, I want to just mention just one reason why I am in favour of marriage equality and have voted already yes in the postal plebiscite. And also maybe say just a little bit about why I've changed my mind, because if I'd got into a time machine and gone back 20 years, and then got back into the time machine and came here, I think I'd be horrified if I was sitting there to have me up here. So I've changed profoundly in my understanding, and I might give a little bit of an idea of why that and how that's happened. Anyway, why am I in favour of marriage equality? I am in favour because the Bible itself encourages me and gives me the freedom to make a decision like this. Let me explain. There are those who argue that the Bible defines marriage at its very outset in Genesis 2:24, which is then quoted by Jesus in Matthew 19:4-6. Haven't you read, said Jesus, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Now, I can understand why people might see this as a definition, or at least as a description of marriage which can be distilled into a definition: one man and one woman united in an ideally permanent union created by God. But that sounds like a definition, which if it was the Bible's definition, we'd maybe have to say, well, that's just the way it is. And we just have to kind of accept it, regardless of what might be some of the implications that Steph has already begun to think through. But as you quickly discover as you read on into the rest of the Bible, biblical marriage simply cannot be defined in so restrictive a way. What you almost immediately encounter in the biblical text are marital variations. Variations which actually had been around for millennia prior to the Bible being written. As you know, almost all of the biblical patriarchs and its kings and its heroes had more than one wife, and in many cases concubines or secondary wives who had children to them as an alternative way to carry on the family line. They were often brought in for that very purpose, to be able to carry on the family line. Abraham, for example, was married to Sarah, and after attempting an alternative route to securing an heir via the Egyptian slave girl Hagar, had Isaac by Sarah, but then later in life he took another wife as well as concubines. A biblical marriage and biblical marital arrangements which are legislated for and allowed for are certainly very different from any definition which can be distilled from Genesis 2 or Matthew 19. And not just because of the presence of polygamy, which has existed in almost all human cultures throughout human history. Now I'm guessing, I'm not going to advocate for polygamy, by the way, but I'm guessing that there are good sociological reasons for polygamy being so widespread, and it is incredibly widespread both historically and even today, with the protection of women and children and the maintenance of property and male power, sadly, likely to be chief among them. But my point is that biblical marriage and biblical families are anything but nuclear families, with the children of biblical parents being birthed and raised in a variety of creative, very creative ways at times. Now, there are aspects to that vibrant ancient reality which we can draw upon and will do in the same-sex marriage if same-sex marriage becomes a reality. But there are also aspects of biblical or ancient forms of marriage which we wouldn't want to embrace and which we've sensibly jettisoned. Polygamy, of course, for example, but also patriarchy. Biblical marriages were highly patriarchal, with almost all the power in the hands of men. We're fast coming to see that patriarchy in our much changed world is not only unnecessary, we don't need to be patriarchal in our arrangements of our marriages, it can also be dangerous with huge potential for damage and the demeaning of wives. In biblical marriages, women and children were owned by their menfolk and by their fathers and husbands who arranged marriages and who needed to be compensated for any damage to their property. So we've now sensibly got rid of that idea, although I think it's only the late 1800s that the idea of your wife being your property and your children being your property was jettisoned. Now, as I said earlier, the Bible encourages us to make a decision like deciding for marriage equality. And my reason for saying that is that the Bible itself begins to undercut and challenge its own marital customs, with Jesus implying the right of women to divorce their husbands, and with the radical equal treatment of women and children by Jesus, and also by Paul, by St. Paul, setting up a trajectory within the Bible on this and other matters which we can sensibly continue along. And so to sum up, the Bible, including Jesus and St. Paul, encourages us to rethink earlier customs. It happened in the Bible, and we're encouraged by that to do the same. And so that is actually what's happening at the moment. We're looking back at ancient biblical texts, both Old Testament and New. We're doing that in the light of contemporary experience and understandings, experiences like Steph has just spoken to us about, and we're saying, what did those ancient texts mean, and what do they mean for us today? And in that painful process of rethinking, what is happening at the moment is that Christians increasingly are coming to the conclusion that Steph has come to. In fact, the biggest movement among Christians in the world is amongst evangelicals. So I came across figures in the last couple of weeks that in the US, 47% of all evangelicals under the age of 53 are now supportive of marriage equality. So that's where the biggest movement is. And why is that movement? Is in terms of evangelicals, people who have a very high view of the scriptures are saying, well, what do those scriptures mean in context, and what do they now mean for us today?